Welcome, my friends, to another episode of Shoot First, Ask Questions Later. Today, we are joined by Rabbi Dr. Zvi Leshem, and we are going to be doing our first tshuva of the Minchas Elazar. In particular, a fan favorite, or at least it's a fan favorite for me, I perceive everyone else seems to be interested in it, is his landmark tshuva on justifying the practice of Hasidim, as well as many others nowadays, of dancing and clapping on Shabbos and Yom Tov. But before we jump in, Rabbi Dr. Zvi Leshem was raised in the United States and made Aliyah in 1979. He was ordained by the chief rabbinate of Israel and received his PhD in Jewish philosophy from Bar Ilan University. After serving as the associate dean of Nishmat and the rabbi of Shirat Shlomo congregation in Efrat, Rabbi Leshem became the director of the Gershom Shalom collection for Kabbalah and Hasidism, or Hasidus, at the National Library of Israel. And I believe a Mazel Tov is in order at the time of recording. I think it's about a week or so after your retirement from that capacity. So shkach for all your good work there, and I'm sure you're going to continue to be spreading Torah on this podcast and many forums. He is the author of Redemptions, contemporary Chassidic essays on the Parsha and the festivals, as well as numerous scholarly rabbinic articles. He and his wife Julie reside in Yerushalayim. Now, I think it is evident already to our listeners from your very extensive bio, very impressive, that you have a love and a specialty in Chassidic literature. So it's no surprise, of course, that we are going to be doing a tshuva that is from a Chassidic author, but I'm curious if you could tell our audience, it's the first time we're doing a tshuva of the Minchas Elazar. Tell us a little bit about the Munkacher, and tell us why you wanted to choose this as your subject of analysis to highlight the Chassidic approach to Halacha.
Thank you very much, Rabbi Kurtz. The very first thing that I want to do is acknowledge my dear friend, Rabbi Dr. Levi Yitzchak Cooper, whose research on the Munkacher Rebbe has been very helpful for me in preparing for this discussion. So I want to first be Makir Tov. The Munkacher Rebbe was Rabbi Chaim Elazar Shapira, who lived from 1871 to 1937 and succeeded his father, the Darkei Tshuva, as the Av Beit Din of Munkach and the Rebbe of the Munkacher Hasidim in 1913. The Munkacher Hasidim, the Shapira family, are descendants of the Bnei Yissaschar, and currently the Rebbe in Borough Park, the current Munkacher Rebbe, is the grandson of the Minchas Elazar. He was famous. He was both a Hasidic Rebbe through and through and a great posek and very prolific author. He's most famous, more than anything else, essentially for his radical extremism in opposition to anything smacking of modernity. Obviously, very anti-Zionist, very anti-anything modern. He put the gymnasium high school, Hebrew high school in Munkach and Cherem, and he was especially vehemently opposed to the Agudat Yisrael movement because, as you know, when people are ostensibly closer to you, you have to be more clear-cut on your opposition so that people don't get confused. So he was very, very opposed to Aguda.
I'm actually very interested in that point because usually, I mean, I grew up in the more yeshiva shavel, but I find myself more situated in the mono-Orthodox community. So I always think of like, maybe it's anachronistic. Nowadays, the Agudas Yisrael, the Moetzes Gedolei Torah, that's like, you don't get more right-wing than, I mean, maybe Neturei Karta or something, but essentially you don't get more right-wing than that. So very briefly, I'm just curious, what were his objections to the Agudas Yisrael?
Well, I think he thought that they were soft on Zionism, relatively. Keep in mind, Aguda today, I think, in general, is a little bit more right-wing than it was in the early 1900s. But in terms of putting it on the scale, the Munkach then was very, very close to what Satmar became today. So that's really the ideological niche that you're talking about, kind of, so to speak, to the left of Neturei Karta, but to the right of everyone else. So that's where you would place him. I think, by the way, I just want to mention that on YouTube, there's an amazing 10-minute video of Munkach in 1933, including the wedding of the Munkacher Rebbe's son-in-law, Rabbi Baruch Rabinowitz, who succeeded him when he died in 1935, and was in a certain sense almost deposed after the Holocaust because of his seeming Zionism, and he ended up being chief rabbi of Cholon in Israel, and his son became the Rebbe in his stead, and is still the Rebbe.
Wow, that's like a scandal. Sometimes you hear, I think on the opposite end, sometimes like Lifisher, Misnagdisher rub on him. They would tear Kriya when their kids became Chasim. I think the Ager family that occurred. So it's funny to see it on the opposite end, so to speak.
Yes, there's a whole chapter on it in Professor Shmuel Heilman's book, Who Will Lead Us. He has a whole chapter on the Munkach succession controversy, if you want to follow up on it.
Wow.
Personally, my reason for interest in this tshuva is several. My father, Zichrono Livracha, grew up in a small village very near Munkach. And even though his family was more aligned with Satmar for reasons which I won't get into now, but Munkach was very much looming in the background as I was growing up. And about 6 years ago, with some of my kids, I traveled to Munkach as part of a kind of roots trip, and we davened there, and there's still a daily minyan there, which is sort of run out of the Munkach headquarters in Borough Park, where we daven and saw all the sites of what used to be a very, very powerful Jewish community, and now is only obviously a small remnant. So I have that personal interest. And when I was a student at Columbia in the 1970s, I davened in the Munkacher Stiebel in Borough Park many times when visiting Chassidic relatives. So I saw the Rebbe, the current Rebbe, who at that time was a very, very young man. I just remember one of the first times I was there was on Sukkot, and he was the Chazan for Hallel, and I remember him crying, and I remember noticing that it was the first time that I ever saw someone cry when they were in davening. I didn't realize, that it was such a powerful experience for people, as important for my education. That's one part. The other half is, as you alluded to in your introduction, that my background is Chassidic, both family-wise and in terms of my scholarship. And I was a rabbi of what could be called a neo-Chassidic shul for many years. And this tshuva about dancing on Shabbat, which, as you pointed out, is very common in Chassidic and neo-Chassidic circles, and no one thinks about it. Everyone takes it for granted, therefore is significant to me in that context as well.
Right. He does open up talking about how nowadays we see Chassidim va'anshe Maisa who are dancing on Shabbos and Yom Tov. I mean, maybe just a lot of people nowadays consider themselves also Chassidim va'anshe Maisa. The dancing and clapping, there's I think it got controversial on the very Misnagdisha and dancing for Karbach Shabbos. They found problems with the dancing. I think in some more liberal circles, they didn't like the idea of Shlomo Karbach. So there's a lot of people who don't really like that whole entire style of davening, though. As you mentioned, this has become popular not just in your immediate shul, but certainly within aspects of the mono-Orthodox community. And I'm pretty sure, if I recall correctly, you could go to, standard Haredi shuls and, whether they call it a Karbach Shabbos or not, whatever it might be, there's dancing, there's clapping. The first time I read the Mishnah in Beitzah, I'm like, wait a minute, it's usher to do that on Shabbos and Yom Tov? And then, of course, I went down the rabbit hole, but the Minchas Elazar did it way before I did, and a way better job. So, Rabbi Leshem, so do you want to tell us a little bit about the Minchas Elazar? What's the issue with dancing on Shabbos and Yom Tov? Because before we explain why it's mutter, we have to first figure out why it's usher.
Why it's an issue at all. Right. Okay, so the Mishnah in Beitzah, in Perek Daled, the second Mishnah, lists a number of things that are asur mishum shvut, things that are prohibited by Chazal, rabbinic prohibitions on Shabbat. And amongst the list is lo mitapchim, velo misapkim, velo merakdim. So mitapchim is probably clapping hands. Misapkim is maybe clapping your hands onto your thighs or something, a similar kind of action. And merakdim is dancing. And the Gemara there explains that the problem is it's basically a gezerah shema yitaken kli shir, that a person might come from this sort of semi-musical activity to make a musical instrument, which would be a clear violation of tikkun kli, of making a vessel on Shabbat, and therefore this was prohibited.
So there isn't just an isser simply of playing an instrument, because maybe you'll come to adjust it and fix it. But there's even almost like a gezerah legezerah going on over here. They shouldn't even dance and clap. Shema, you might pick up an instrument, and Shema, you might then have to fix it.
Or maybe you'll make an instrument from scratch. Now, the Minchas Elazar is going to talk about that distinction. There is a chiluk made between making a new vessel and fixing an existing vessel. But I'll come to that in a minute when I describe his methodology a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
But that's the issue. Now, how did earlier sources deal with it? The Rambam basically continues to say that it's usher. Some of the Gaonim point out that it's permissible on Simchat Torah, because on Simchat Torah, the dancing is lichvod HaTorah, in honor of the Torah. And if a person's involved in honoring the Torah, they're not going to forget and do something prohibited. That's the theory behind that. The Shulchan Aruch, following the Rambam, basically leaves it as asur, and that's why you see people, especially Litvish people, clapping with a shinui, that they won't forget and go from that to.
That's me. I do that
okay.
when I have to. I don't want to be Porishman at Tzibor, so I'll do that begrudgingly.
Okay.
But so this is what's interesting, right? So the Magen Avram quotes the Maharik, who quotes Rav Haigon, who says that there actually is an ancient practice already to dance on Simchas Torah. So how do we make this? Isn't just like some new thing that some breakaway from Judaism decide to reform things. This is on the books in the times of the Gaonim at very least, and it's at odds with an explicit Mishnah.
Right, and well, let's continue with our survey of the Rishonim. The Toso, which is very important for us, come along and say, "Ein anu bikiim ba'asiyat kli shir." We don't know how to make musical instruments these days, and therefore the gezerah, the prohibition, no longer applies. Now that's problematic because we know there's a whole principle that even if a reason for a gezerah doesn't apply anymore, generally speaking, the gezerah is still on the books. Rav Moshe talks about that in Igrod Moshe here, but what's important and most important for us is the Ramah here. The Ramah, obviously, as Ashkenazim, the Ramah brings two reasons to permit what apparently in his time was already fairly common, it seems like. Firstly, it says, Mutiv shiu shogin v'lo yu mezidim. It's better if people are dancing or clapping, they're not going to listen to us, so better not to tell them, and at least it'll only be a vera b'shogeg, not a purposeful prohibition. And then he says, or maybe we hold like the Tosfot that we don't know how to make a kli shir these days, so therefore the prohibition is not applicable. Either way, it's pretty b'diavad, right? It's either, better that they do it b'shogeg and the b'mezid, or it's relying on a Tosfot, which is also somewhat problematic.
Right, that's what's amazing about how he codifies those two suggestions of Tosfos, and either one is a radical suggestion. Either everyone is sinning and better just not to take up the fight because it's not worth it, people won't listen, and which that's pretty damning for those who want to do that as a religious experience, who are supposedly frummer doing it. And then the other option is either to say, no, it's completely permissible because the impetus for the gezerah no longer applies. And that also is something which is radical. So either way you slice it, we don't really have a comfortable heter here, as you said.
Exactly. So this is where the Minchas Elazar steps in, and he wants to and to read the title of the tshuva, just which you I think you mentioned it briefly, is the Devar shenagu Hasidim v'anshe Ma'aseh l'raked b'Shabbatot v'yomim tovim v'lo chashashu la'ach de'ein merakdim ve'ein mesapkim. How is it that Hasidim and people of great merit dance and do this on Shabbat and they don't worry about this Isser? Okay, so I'm not going to read from the tshuva. I just want to quote one line, which is it's very, very long. And he also goes off on some long, detailed, interesting tangents, for example, about playing musical instruments on Chol HaMoed, which he brings a achron that prohibited, which he thinks is really outlandish, but that's really a tangent. But he does say one thing here, and he says that the Mishnah in Beitzah doesn't see dancing on Shabbat as being any kind of a mitzvah, which would be maybe a mitigating factor, and maybe that's what came in on Simchat Torah as the mitigating factor, lichvod Torah. But he says the following interesting thing: Kevan she'eno mitzvah lekol adam, rak lemi sheboer bekirbo rishvei eish shel hevet Hashem simchat Yom Tov asher hinchalnu. Aval lo lekol adam hu tircha ve'eno simcha shel mitzvah imein choshek la. Basically says there are two types of people when it comes to dancing on Shabbat and Shul. There are the people who are filled with a burning fire inside them, the fire of Hashem and the joy of Yom Tov, and they can't control themselves. And for them, apparently, he's going to prove that it is a mitzvah. That's going to be his goal. But he says there are other people that getting up, they'd rather just sit there, to get up and have to dance around is a tircha for them. It's a burden, and they would rather skip it. He says for those people, it's definitely not a mitzvah. So it's an interesting way to, early on in the tshuva, that he's making this distinction that basically the heter that he is going to find in the end, after a long analysis, is really going to be only for someone who feels emotionally inspired, spiritually inspired to get up and dance, although he is going to essentially apply that to all the Hasidim who follow their Rebbes and join in the common practice in the Chassidic and today neo-Chassidic shuls and dance around and clap their hands without a shinui, and that those people are going to be, in a sense, elevated into the category of those people who have this burning desire to serve Hashem joyfully, and for them it becomes a mitzvah, which is a mitigating factor. And here you have the Hasidic element of the tshuva, because essentially religious fervor or the religious experience or the mystical experience, if you will, the desire for some achievement of devekut becomes a mitigating factor in a halachic discussion, which would not be true for a non-Hasidic posek by and large.
Right. I think like
general before we get into the details of how he does that. Yeah.
Right. I think your point's well taken, and this is something I've noticed in the Minchas Elazar especially, but I think in broader Chassidish methodology, they'll take something which is generally, if you look at the sources, not sitting the Sukkah on Shmini Atzeres, he has a tshuva on that one as well, which it would seem is sinful to ignore what it says in explicit Gemara and Shulchan Aruch. And not only will they be matzdik, not only will they justify, but they'll go on the offensive and they'll even say, no, it's not just simply we're allowed to dance, we're holier and therefore we dance. And when you look at the language over here, like you just read, initially it sounds very diplomatic. It sounds like, look, those who like to dance and that's how they serve God, good for them. Those who aren't into it, they have other ways, elu ve'elu. But then his proof is that he turns to the Simchas Beitzah Shoeva, he quotes the Rambam, that it wasn't just, the Stam Amaretz like me who was going to be there dancing. It was the Gedolei Chachamim Yisrael, Rasha Yeshivos and Hedrech Hasim Zakeim Maisa. It actually says, if you're on a higher madrega, you're going to be dancing on Shabbos and Yom Tov. So he really flips it on his head. He takes what is seemingly ostensibly an Aveira and turns it into a mitzvah.
So I do want to say one thing that my friend Rabbi Levi Cooper points out quite strongly is the Minchas Elazar was perhaps the greatest defender of minhagim in his era. That compared to, for example, the Mishnah Brura had no trouble overturning minhagim when it went against the written sources, or as opposed to even the Aruch HaShulchan, who defended minhagim by finding them sources. The Minchas Elazar went to great extremes to do very creative, let's say, hermeneutics or halachic reasoning in order to defend minhagim. And you mentioned Shmini Atzeret and the Sukkah and many others, and this would fall into that category as well. So as you mentioned, yes, he basically does a radical hermeneutical move of turning the average chassid dancing on Shabbat and Yom Tov into the kind of a yichidei skula that were described in the Rambam at the end of Hilchot Lulav as the people who would dance in Simchat Beit HaShoeva, and basically therefore elevates their whole dance to a kind of Simcha Shal Mitzvah, which is, again, similar to what we would say about Simchat Torah, apparently, and therefore mitigates against the fear of Tikkun Kli. Another thing that he does talk about at some length, and it's really interesting also historical context, is he asks, why is this dancing on Shabbat any better than the reformers, who obviously he was absolutely opposed to, right? If he's opposed to
like Agudas Yisrael, he definitely didn't like that.
Right? And Mizrahi, so obviously Reform, who had, and I think in his context it's more the neologue, who is, Hungarian, who had introduced the use of organs in the shul on Shabbat and Yom Tov, and the use of a musical instrument is the same prohibition as dancing. It's the same Mishnah, basically. It's the same reason. Shema Yitakain Kli. There he does make the distinction, which is quite logical, and he's certainly not his chiddush, between playing an existing instrument where you are like, let's say you're playing a guitar and the string breaks. So if you're a guitar player, you know how to fix the string. It's not such a big deal. Whereas if you're dancing and singing without any musical accompaniment, then it's much less like you're going to somehow sit down from scratch and build a guitar or build a piano. Most people don't know how to do that. Whereas opposed to if I'm playing an organ in shul and something breaks and I know how to fix it, I might very well do that. So he does make that distinction between what we do and what the reformers do, even though it seems like
I think that's actually
problem.
I think that's actually a logical distinction. It sits well with me on an abstract, logical level. But I think the issue categorically is that, as you mentioned, Chazal, for the same reason, authored all of these things. So from a halachically formalistic level, what right do we have to go into the minds of Chazal and say this one was made al tanai, this one had a built-in stipulation, and the other one didn't, especially when they are kind of classified together from the standpoint of the Talmud?
Yeah, it is a big chiddush, but as I said, he's not the first to say it, and it makes a certain kind of logic on the practical sense. I think we'd all agree it's easier to fix a guitar string than to build a guitar. But maybe here we'll jump to more up to date, personal and halachic. I, for many, many, many years, worked very, very closely with Rav Yehuda Herzl Henkin Zatzal at Nishmat, the author of the 4 volumes of the Tshuvot B'nai Banim. And he has a tshuva in the first volume. Sorry, forget. Okay, I have it written down somewhere. I don't remember. You'll edit this part.
Torah Shabbal Pets. Torah Shabbal Pet.
Okay, whatever. He has a long tshuva, which is not on exactly the same case. It's about banging on glasses and dishes along with zmirot on Shabbat. So it's sort of similar, but I'm not clapping my hands. I'm banging the spoon on the side of a glass, for example, which he saw that a certain Rav had permitted. In none of his tshuvas, he never tells you who he's responding to. And he took the initiative to write a long tshuva of why this is asur. And he as well mentions the distinction between making new vessels and fixing old ones, but he doesn't accept that. He mentions the Minchas Elazar, and he does not accept the idea that anything that's done for Simcha and Shabbat and Yom Tov is the same as Kavod HaTorah. The heter for Simcha Torah, he writes that Kavod HaTorah specifically means Kavod Sefer HaTorah, and not Kavod HaTorah in a broader way. And he he comes out very, very machmir on this. He leaves regular clapping as kind of mutav shiyu shogegim sort of thing. Dancing, he held that the way we walk around shul is not considered dancing because you have always one foot on the ground, and he himself would do that as well. But he thought that banging on a spoon on the side of the glass was much more like a musical instrument, and that was a new heter that he strongly prohibited. Now, I will point out that many times I was with him on Shabbat at events at Nishmat, and I would be chazan for Kabbalat Shabbat, and he would not allow me to, let alone not clap, not bang on the table, nothing. I had to be, very straight Litvish chazan when I was in his presence, and he knew that was sort of hard for me as coming from a more Chassidic background and style of davening, and he'd always give me a nice big yasher koch and a smile after davening, almost I think to say that I'm getting schar ala prisha, that I'm getting some reward for the fact that I held back from what I would wanted to do out of kavod for him, which of course I had great kavod for him.
That's remarkable. I didn't really know. I guess I always assumed Rav Henkin, of course, came from that kind of Litvish tradition. And he certainly held to it as well. So I actually wanted to get your take on this. There are Gemaras that seem to push in a different direction, not just for halachic reasons, but for hashkafic reasons. So here we have the Minchas Elazar who's making this argument about how the dancing, the clapping, the fervor is all in pursuit of the religious experience. Unlike Rav Henkin and others who just left Rav Hai going where it was and left it strictly for Kavod Sefer Torah, the Minchas Elazar extrapolates and says this isn't a begrudging heter or mutav shu shogin, but actually it doesn't have to be kavod Torah, it can be kavod Yom Tov, it can be kavod Shabbos, and we can extrapolate more broadly to general avodas Hashem. So I guess the question I always wonder, and again, I'm a card-carrying litvak. In your machlokis, I probably am much more on the Rav Hankins side, just where I land. Something that's, I thought about is, I think it's a Gemara, I forget where, maybe in Sanhedrin. It's talking about shirim in particular, but many seem to expand it beyond it, in which the Torah is chogeres sak, and it comes before HaKadosh Baruch Hu lamenting, saying, Asuni banecha ki kinor shemenagdim bo leitzim. Your children have turned me into this instrument that's going to be used to entertain themselves. And basically using psukim from Tanakh, using sacred words from the Chumash, from HaKadosh Baruch Hu, so that I can have fun at a concert on Chol Moed at a Pesach program.
Mm-hmm.
So how do we know, what is the litmus test for determining, at least according to the Chassidic approach, when is it using the Torah as a way of serving ourselves? This is very Yeshayahu Leibovich. He's written a lot about that.
Yeah.
And how do we know when we are using it in order to elevate and toward Avodas Hashem? And I can imagine that in many minyanim, there can be some people who are there more for the Avodas Hashem, and there's some people who just really love a Karmach Shabbos. They really love the concert. And so how do you determine when it's Lishma, when Shalol Lishma, and that it actually meets the threshold of Kavod HaTorah?
That's a wonderful and important question. And I refer everyone to the book that came out recently from the Orthodox Union, Orthodox Forum, about uses and something, I forget the title exactly, about neo-Hasidism, uses and misuses maybe. Certainly that's some of the articles talk about it. And you have some correspondence on this topic between Rav Shagar and Rav Lichtenstein, or actually really more writing of Rav Lichtenstein attacking Rav Shagar, who was one of my I studied by both of them, Baruch Hashem. This is a huge question in Avodat Hashem, and certainly today. And I think obviously the breakdown between the Litvish and here Leibovitz is the extreme, of course, on the one hand, and the more Hasidic approach is very, very significant. And for lack of time to really have a long discussion about it, I would point to the Rabbi who I have done most research on, and in many ways very, very close in terms of my own avoda, which is the Piaseczner Rabbi. And the piece of Rav Kalanimus Kalma Shapira, different Shapira, no relation to the Minchas Elazar. And he, throughout his books, really, where he stresses more than anything else the importance of being emotional in Avodat Hashem. I think if I had to pick one word to sum up his whole approach, it would be regesh, the emotions. And he, in various places, gives us what I would say is a heter to strive for devekut through emotional religious experience. In other words, he basically would not accept her question to begin with. That's, I think, his answer is that, yes, there is obviously an approach that would say that we have to be erring on the side of caution of, let's say, spiritual integrity, not intellectual integrity, spiritual integrity, and asking ourselves all the time that question that Leibowitz always asks us, and it's important to keep us, honest, so to speak, is, are you really doing avodat Hashem, or are you doing some kind of avodah zorah of self-service? Mm-hmm. And that's a real question, and it's a question that everyone has to ask themselves all the time, and not only about dancing on Shabbat, about lots and lots of things, but obviously when you take on something new that's beyond halacha or questionable within halacha in any way, then obviously it becomes a more acute question. But the Piaseczner basically bottom line is that the most important thing for us is to feel a strong emotional connection with Hashem, and that's okay. And we shouldn't get bogged down in the question of, well, am I really totally lishma, or maybe something here is just because it feels good. Maybe it feels good for me, to dance on Shabbat, and it makes me feel good that I'm feeling close to Hashem, but is it real? And he says, if you feel that way, that it's real, then there is something there of religious significance, and the religious / mystical experience of feeling some kind of dvekut with Hashem through something like, for example, dancing. And the Piaseczner, we know, even went beyond that and did somersaults that he writes about in his diary, for example.
Emulating David HaMelech.
Right,
Not did somersaults, yes.
Yes, yeah, he alludes to David HaMelech in that piece in his diary, that is a legitimate approach. And I would then go on and living today, although what first attracted me very much to the Piaseczner was how much his description of religious life and educational problems in Poland in the 1930s was so similar to what was going on in Israel or in America in the end of the 20th and beginning of the 21st century. Um, if we want to keep our kids connected strongly to Yiddishkeit today, then it needs to be a religion where one feels joy and connection and meaningful. The Piaseczner says in one of his diary posts that people need to get emotional thrills or else they'll become sick. And you can get them from one of three places: from Averas, which is obviously we don't want, from neutral things like, I don't know, going on a roller coaster, which is okay, but it's not the great, or from passion and emotional excitement in your religious life. So therefore, if you're davening, and if we give our kids davening and learning and kiyum mitzvot full of joy and excitement, that will give them the emotional thrills, so to speak, that everyone's neshama needs, and that will hopefully help to keep them connected to Yiddishkeit in a way that, sorry here to come out, that a more drier, perhaps Litvish approach in this context of this discussion may have trouble with. Now, I realize there are problems in the other direction as well,
Right.
but that's the side I would come out on.
Right. And I appreciate you articulating that. I do want to dispel a notion, I think it was Rav Shach. They said that his son went off the derech, which I think meant just he became modern Orthodox. But from their standpoint, it was off the derech. And this is a story that they tell all the time, that they asked him what happened. He said, I didn't sing enough Zmiris with him at the table. Now, I don't think anyone would ever accuse Rav Shach of being overly Chassidish and not Litvish enough. So I think even in the Litvische Welt, and you see there's a lot of cross-pollination. You'll see things that kind of Malava Malkas that resemble Tishes. There's been a lot of cross-pollination in that respect. But so I think also your point about the Hasidic approach, about the emphasis on emotions well taken, I think what's unique about the circumstance in Minchas Elazar is that the stakes are higher. It's that the whole heter is built upon the premise that one is doing it l'shem kavod haTorah or l'shem kavod yantiv, and that's why the stakes are a little bit higher, and that's why it might be a little bit more a jump too high for many in the more Litvische Welt. So let me ask you a question, just because we're drawing toward a close. Is there anything else just about the Minchas Elazar, his methodology, or just general Hasidic methodology that you want to leave our listeners with?
So I think that what we see here, and this is the bottom line, why this is an interesting tshuva besides the technical and creative analysis of the sources, is that what makes it a Hasidic tshuva is the willingness to take into account the religious experience or the mystical experience as a value, which is then elevated to a, let's say, not another source, but another it's elevated to being like a halachic value. And as we're weighing here through this tshuva back and forth between the various sources and svaras that are lahatir or leesor, then here's another one, that if people are serving Hashem in their understanding because of their passionate desire to do so through dancing, that religious experience becomes a value which is taken seriously. It's the opposite of if Leibovich would have considered it avodah zarah, and maybe a straight more, and Rav Henkin would consider. Rav Henkin uses a phrase, by the way, in his tshuva about banging a spoon on a glass. He calls it simcha haba'a ba'avera.
Ooh, that's a good one.
Right?
I'm
That's
pocketing that one.
Simcha haba'a ba'avera. So that would be the more the Litvish approach to okay, it's very good to be have simcha and avodat Hashem, but there are very clear halachic guidelines, and they must be kept. And the fact that this makes you feel good is not going to become a value that's going to have any significance in my decision. Whereas for the Minchas Elazar, the experience of the Chassid as feeling a state of dveikut or striving for a state of dveikut with Hashem through expressing joy becomes part of the equation that's worked through in determining the final answer. And that's what makes it a Hasidic approach to halacha.
Thank you. And I think this was an excellent choice, as you just articulated. It's very emblematic of the unique Hasidic approach in dealing with halachic issues. And the Munkacher is just a great example of someone who had the mastery, of course, of Hasidus, and also the same mastery of the halachic literature that you would expect from any also non-Hasidic posek. And so I want to thank you very much for your time, Rabbi Dr. Leshem. It's such a joy. I know we've been in touch like kind of on social media a little bit for a while. It's such a joy to learn from you directly now. I wish you much enjoyment, much hatzlacha with your retirement. Of course, I'm confident it's not going to be a true retirement. I'm sure you're going to find many different ways beyond to contribute to the knowledge and experience of the Jewish people. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu should bless you with many more chances and capacities to do that in.
I mean, Chodesh Tov, and we should all have a
yes, a good Chodesh. A good Chodesh. Take care.